It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My parents were out of town, leaving me home alone in their house nestled deep in the woods, the kind of house that's serene during the day, but unsettling when night falls. The property bordered a small pond, one I'd spent countless summer afternoons swimming in as a kid. But on this particular night, that pond would become the source of a terror I'll never forget. The night started off normal. I spent most of it watching TV, scrolling through my phone, and enjoying the rare peace and quiet. It wasn't until around midnight that I noticed something strange. At first, it was faint, a sound I could barely make out over the hum of the TV. I muted the screen, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft splash coming from the direction of the pond. It didn't make sense. The pond wasn't very big, and there weren't any fish that could make a noise like that. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just a raccoon or some other animal. But as the minutes ticked by, the splashes grew louder and more deliberate. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight, slipped on my shoes, and stepped outside. The cool night air sent a chill down my spine as I made my way toward the pond. The splashing had stopped, but now there was something else. A faint humming, like a tune being softly sung, coming from the water's edge. I froze. The light from my flashlight wavered as my hands began to shake. The sound wasn't normal. It didn't sound human or animal. It sounded wrong, as if it were coming from somewhere deep and hollow. I took a step closer. That's when I saw him. A man was standing ankle-deep in the water, his back to me. His frame was thin, almost skeletal, and his head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I wanted to call out to him, to ask what he was doing on our property, but something inside me screamed to stay quiet, to stay hidden. Then, without warning, he turned around. The flashlight caught his face, pale and sunken, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. His mouth twisted into a grin so wide it looked unnatural, almost painful. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. Darkness consumed the scene, but I could hear him. The humming had turned into laughter, low and guttural, like it was bubbling up from deep inside his chest. I ran. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. My heart was pounding as I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, trying to explain what had happened. But when they arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area and found no signs of anyone. No footprints by the pond. No evidence that someone had been there at all. But I know what I saw. I never stayed at my parents' house alone after that night. And to this day, I can't look at that pond without feeling a chill creep down my spine. Some things are better left unexplored in the dark. It happened on a quiet Friday night. My parents had gone out to dinner, leaving me alone in the house for the evening. At 16, I was used to being left on my own, but something about that night felt different. The house seemed colder, quieter. I brushed it off as my imagination and settled onto the couch with my laptop. It was around 10 p.m. when I first heard it. A faint knock at the front door. Not a loud knock, not frantic, just gentle, deliberate. I paused my video, staring at the door. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where no one just drops by, especially not this late. For a moment, I debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty. The street beyond was bathed in the dim orange glow of the streetlights. I felt a small chill creep up my spine, but convinced myself it was probably just a prank. Kids in the neighborhood loved messing with people. I locked the door and went back to the couch. 10 minutes later, the knock came again. This time, it was louder, still slow and deliberate, but heavier, like whoever or whatever was knocking wanted me to know they were there. My stomach tightened. I crept to the door, this time standing a few feet back. "Who is it?" I called out. No response. I peeked through the peephole again. Still nothing. But as I stared at the empty porch, something caught my eye. Across the street, beneath the shadow of a tall oak tree, I saw movement. A figure stood there, half hidden in the darkness. I couldn't make out any features, but they were tall, unnaturally tall, and completely still. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and texted my parents, telling them someone was outside. My dad responded quickly, "Stay inside, don't open the door, we'll be home soon." I locked every door and window in the house, double-checking each one. But no matter how secure I made the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then the sound changed. It wasn't knocking anymore. It was scratching, faint, almost hesitant, like fingernails trailing across the wood of the back door. I froze in place. The back door led to our yard, and it didn't have a peephole. Slowly, I crept toward the kitchen, where the door was, and flipped on the porch light. The scratching stopped. Taking a deep breath, I pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. The yard was empty. I let out a shaky laugh, more to calm myself than anything. "You're losing it," I whispered to myself. "It's just your imagination." But as I let the curtain fall back into place, I noticed something. On the glass, near the edge of the door, were faint smudges, long, thin streaks that trailed downward, as if someone, or something, had been dragging their fingers across it. I backed away, my pulse racing. I grabbed the largest kitchen knife I could find and bolted upstairs to my room, locking the door behind me. For a while, everything was quiet, too quiet. I sat on my bed, knife in hand, staring at the door, straining to hear anything. And then, the floorboards creaked. Not in the hallway, not on the stairs, in my room. I didn't dare move. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything out of place. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough for someone to hide inside. I told myself it had been like that earlier, that I'd left it open, but I knew I hadn't. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No response. My hand trembled as I stood up, knife at the ready. I took a shaky step toward the closet, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop. The door creaked open a little more. I froze. From the darkness inside, a voice whispered, "Why did you lock me out?" My scream caught in my throat as I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I tore down the stairs and out the front door, barefoot and shaking. When my parents got home 15 minutes later, they found me sitting on the curb, clutching the knife and sobbing. The police searched the house but found no one. The back door was wide open, though I knew I had locked it. They said it was probably just a prank, but I knew better. That wasn't a prank. Whoever, or whatever it was, they had been inside the house, and they hadn't needed the door to get in. It all started when I decided to clean out my parents' old house after they retired and moved across the country. The house was big and old, built in the 1950s, with creaky floors and a damp, unfinished basement. I'd grown up there, but I never liked the basement. It always felt colder than it should, even in the summer, and it had this faint, earthy smell that never went away. It was late in the afternoon when I started clearing out the basement. Most of it was filled with boxes of holiday decorations, old tools, and junk my parents had kept over the years. As I worked my way through the clutter, I found something I'd forgotten about entirely: the crawl space. The crawl space was tucked into the far corner of the basement, behind an old metal shelving unit. When I was a kid, my dad had always told me to stay away from it. He said it was just too small and dirty, filled with spiders and dust. I never questioned him, but now, as I stood in front of it, something about it seemed off. The wooden hatch covering the crawl space had been nailed shut at some point, but the nails were rusted and the wood looked warped, like it had been pried open before. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a hammer from one of the toolboxes and started pulling the nails out. The wood groaned as I lifted the hatch, revealing a dark, narrow space beneath. The smell hit me first, a strong, musty odor mixed with something sour. I wrinkled my nose and shone my flashlight inside. The crawl space wasn't very big, maybe 4 feet tall and about 6 feet deep. The ground was dirt, uneven and damp, and the walls were unfinished concrete. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about it, just an empty space. But as I scanned the beam of my flashlight around, I saw something strange. In the far corner, partially buried in the dirt, was a small wooden box. I crawled inside, the dirt crunching softly under my hands and knees, and reached for the box. It was heavier than I expected, and the wood was old and splintered. There was no lock, just a simple latch keeping it closed. I carried it out of the crawl space and sat on the basement floor, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. I hesitated for a moment before flipping the latch and opening the lid. Inside, there were photographs, dozens of them. They were old, faded black and white pictures, curled at the edges. At first, they seemed normal, portraits of people, most of them smiling or posing awkwardly for the camera. But as I flipped through them, I realized something was wrong. The faces in the photos weren't quite right. Some of them were blurred, as if the camera had moved while taking the picture, but only the faces. The rest of the image was perfectly clear. Others had strange distortions. Their eyes were too big, their mouths stretched too wide, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. And then there were the later photos. They weren't portraits anymore. They showed people standing in rooms, some of them crying, others screaming. In one photo, a man was clawing at a door. In another, a woman was staring at the camera, her face frozen in terror. I wanted to stop looking, but I couldn't. I kept flipping through until I reached the last photo. It was a picture of the crawl space. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakable. The same dirt floor, the same concrete walls. In the center of the crawl space, there was a figure crouched on all fours, facing away from the camera. Its limbs were too long, its back arched unnaturally, and its head was turned, just slightly, as if it had been caught mid-motion. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the crawl space. My blood ran cold. The hatch was still open, and the light from my flashlight was shining inside. Something moved. It wasn't big, just a quick, scuttling motion, like an animal darting through the dirt. But it was enough to send me scrambling to my feet. I slammed the hatch shut and grabbed the hammer, nailing it back into place as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the hammer. When I was done, I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the hatch. The scratching had stopped. I packed up the photos and left the basement, locking the door behind me. I didn't go back down there for the rest of the day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, soft thuds, faint creaks, and that unmistakable scratching sound. The next morning, I called a contractor to seal off the crawl space permanently. He came by a few days later, and I watched as he poured cement over the hatch, sealing it shut. But even now, when I'm alone in the house, I swear I can still hear it. The scratching, faint, but there, like something's trying to find its way out.